Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a very informative session this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Jason Jones, board member with the APB for the last number of years. And the presentation today is part of our continuing mission, for lack of a better phrase, to provide members of the APB and beyond with opportunities to better understand the tools we need to execute ourselves in a professional manner. And I want to give a big shout out to Chloe Boynton and Jesse Russell for reaching out to us and offering to give this presentation today to the APB on the modernization of the Migratory Birds Regulations associated with the MBCA. Just as an FYI, we have far more registrants for this webinar than we have members. So if this type of programming, I feel like I'm on a fund drive for PBS, if this kind of programming appeals to you and you want to help support the APB in continuing its mission, for example, we had to upgrade our webinar system to be able to accommodate the high demand for registrations for this program. Please consider joining the APB if you aren't already a member, and passing the word along to colleagues who aren't members. But with no further ado, one small point. Because of the overwhelming number of people registered, close to 700 now, we obviously aren't going to be able to do a live question and answer with that many people. So if you do have questions as the presentation is ongoing, please enter them into the chat function in the toolbar. Jesse and I will be tracking those while Chloe's given the presentation. And as time allows at the end, we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. For those questions we don't get to, I'll follow up with Chloe and Jesse after the presentation, and we'll put together some sort of briefing note that'll ideally address most of the common questions that we have. And now, with no further ado, Chloe, Migratory Bird Biologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, thank you so much to you and to Jesse for volunteering to be here today. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jason. Just double checking you can hear me okay? Okay. Want to start on my long spiel without making sure people can actually hear me. So my name is Chloe Boynton. As Jason mentioned, I'm going to be leading the presentation, and I have my colleague Jesse Russell with me online, who's going to also be helping behind the scenes, and we'll be answering some questions at the end. So the topic today is focusing on the new regulations, but I'm going to be covering a little bit more than that. So just a quick outline. I'm going to start off by talking about the status of birds in Canada, switching to the actual legislation, talking about the prohibitions, and then covering some of the key changes to the Migratory Birds Regulations, which have come into effect as of July 2022. So that includes changes to prohibitions, permitting, temporary possession, and recognition of Indigenous Section 35 rights. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about incidental take and our general avoidance guidelines for harming migratory birds, which might be familiar to some folks on the line, and we'll emphasize that those will remain despite the regulations, despite the changes to some of the regulations. So I really wanted to start off this presentation because for a lot of us, I'm assuming, online are biologists, and as a reminder to why the legislation is important. So there was a published report on the state of Canada's birds back in 2019, which is the most relevant or the most updated report. And this really highlighted that continuing, a number of birds are showing strong declines. So a lot of groups of birds like aerial insectivores, grassland birds, shorebirds have populations that are rapidly declining, but there are groups of birds that are either stable or showing increases. And a lot of the birds like waterfowl and birds of prey, this is due to informed conservation to help these groups recover. So that includes things like banning DDT, as well as investing in waterfowl and wetland conservation. In addition to these groups of species in Canada showing these dramatic population declines, there was a paper published in the same year by Ken Rosenberg in Science that showed that we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. And what I wanted to highlight with this paper is that it's focusing on the number of individuals lost, not just population trajectories, which is what the State of Canada's birds focuses on. Declines of bird populations are often indirectly related to habitat loss, which I think a lot of us know is one of the key drivers. But as Ken Rosenberg's paper really highlights, direct annual mortality is another issue facing birds and can be largely attributed to human activities. So there's a paper back in 2018 published by Calvert and colleagues that showed annual mortality across Canada for birds is quite large and is variable across sectors. But what I really want to highlight with this paper and this graph is not picking out individual sectors, but highlighting the cumulative impacts of all of these activities across these sectors and how it is actually quite a big conservation issue facing birds, and I think one that is not as prominent or not discussed as much. And for those that are curious, this graph is from that paper, and it's just showing the total number of birds killed each year by sector, and cats being the #1 issue in this case. This brings me to the legislation, and as biologists, I think we can actually use the legislation as a tool for conservation of birds. The main point of the Act and the corresponding regulations is to protect migratory birds, their nests, and eggs on all land tenures anywhere in Canada. The Act is implemented through 2 main regulations, the Migratory Birds Regulations, which I'll focus on today, as well as Migratory Birds Sanctuary Regulations. This Act includes prohibitions as well as the regulations, which are considered strict liability offenses. So the intent does not matter. So whether you know you violated the Act or you don't even know it exists, you can still be prosecuted under the legislation. It's also important to note that there are going to be some species of birds that are protected under the Migratory Birds Convention Act and are also afforded protection under the Species at Risk Act. So they have kind of dual protection under these legislation. There are several main prohibitions that I think are always worth highlighting in the Act and regulations. And the first is in the Act itself and has not changed. So you cannot deposit a substance that's harmful to migratory birds. So that's in areas or other waters frequented by birds. The regulations, those prohibitions will be undergoing some changes, which I'll highlight in the next couple of slides. So the first is you can't hunt a migratory bird without a permit, which seems obvious, but where this prohibition actually really had its teeth was in how hunt was defined within the regulations, which was that you could not capture, kill, injure, or harass a migratory bird. Another main prohibition is that you cannot disturb, destroy, or take a nest or an egg or a nest box. And lastly, you can't possess a live migratory bird, either a carcass, a skin, or the nest or an egg of a migratory bird. So I'll go into some of the changes to the regulations. So as I mentioned before, these came into force as of July 2022, so they are in effect now. The first prohibition that underwent a change was really more of a clarification. So this is the prohibition that you can't hunt a migratory bird. So in the new regulations, they have essentially just separated the general prohibition from that definition of hunt. So you're putting the actual wording right in the legislation, so it's quite clear that you cannot capture, kill, take, injure, or harass a migratory bird. So this is really just a clarification. One of the bigger changes that I think probably a lot of folks are interested in is to nest protection. And so in the previous regulations, there is legal protection of all nests at all times, whether they're active or not active. There was no definition within the regulations that specified this. So in the new regulations, the main goal is to provide protection of active nests with a subset of species nests that are continued to be protected year-round. So the wording of the two prohibitions doesn't change very much, but where the main change comes into effect is in the exceptions to damaging or destroying a nest. The main exceptions to this prohibition against nest removal, damage, destruction, disturbance is that a nest or a nest box must contain a viable egg or a live bird, or be listed as a species under Schedule 1. There's 18 species on this list. Species that are listed under Schedule 1, their nests can be removed, damaged, or destroyed if they've been determined to be abandoned, a notice to the minister has been supplied, and the designated waiting time has been met. So I'll go into detail on this in the next few slides. The main goal of these changes is really to provide protection to all nests when they have a high conservation value. So that's when they contain an egg or a bird, so a nestling or an adult bird, and provides exceptions to those prohibitions when that conservation value becomes lower. So that's typically outside of the breeding season for most species. However, we do recognize that for some species, that high conservation value actually exists year-round because of heavy reliance on reuse of nests, hence that list of species under Schedule 1. I won't talk about SARA too much, but I wanted to also note that there are going to be some species at risk. They're also migratory birds that have year-round protection of their nests or residences under SARA. Nest is included in the SARA definition of residence, and for migratory birds that are listed as endangered, extirpated, or threatened, they will have protection of their residences, which is across all land tenures in Canada. This is the list of Schedule 1 species and their corresponding designated waiting times. So there's 18 species here. Majority of them are their nests are protected for a year outside of the breeding season, and then some for 2 years, and then pileated woodpecker for 3. The rationale behind these designated waiting times is that when a nest remains unoccupied by a migratory bird for the minimum number of months indicated, it suggests a probable abandonment of that nest, and therefore that nest no longer has that high conservation value for migratory birds. There is a set of criteria for species to make this list, which includes or doesn't include SARA species because they already have protections afforded by the SARA legislation. The list did not include species that nest on anthropogenic structures, and species on this list all reuse their nest, or they have nests that are reused by other migratory birds. And the last piece of criteria to highlight is nest identification outside of the breeding season was a requirement. So we've gotten lots of questions about pileated woodpecker. I'm sure we will today. So I wanted to just highlight the rationale for including the species on Schedule 1. So I've already mentioned this, but I think it's really important to highlight that the previous regulations really protected nests of all migratory birds year-round, wherever they were found, for as long as they existed, essentially. And when we were amending the regulations, we focused on these protections that didn't provide a conservation benefit for migratory birds. So that's year-round nest protection for most species. We know, of course, that a large portion of pileated woodpecker nesting cavities are actually reused by other migratory bird species. Therefore, protection of pileated woodpecker nests outside of the breeding season until they become abandoned as per the regulations actually provides not only a high conservation value for pileated woodpecker, but for other migratory birds as well. The natural nest cavities that pileated woodpeckers create are particularly large and are generally more limited in a forested landscape. And so that's why their nests can be crucial for some secondary cavity nest users. Another reason for including pileated woodpecker on this list, as opposed to other woodpecker species, is that their nesting cavities are more easily identifiable to the species. So the abandoned nest notification is the system you can use when you need to remove an unoccupied nest of species on Schedule 1. So you can submit a notification, and that's what starts the clock on that designated waiting time. It can't just be when you decide. And so the notifications are submitted to our abandoned nest registry, which is available on our website. And you just need to fill in some basic details when you submit the notification. Administrative details for the first page, contact name, address, phone number, and then information about the nest itself or nests, which so species name, number of nests, and the location of these nests. Once that's done, monitoring must occur to ensure the nest remains unoccupied by the migratory birds. The regulations don't specify what monitoring looks like. The onus will be on the proponent or the person who submitted the notification. But realistically, in order to actually determine if a nest is not being used, verifications and monitoring should occur at some time when a nest is likely to be in use. So typically spring or summer for most species. So if you only check a nest in December, for example, and it's not being used, that's not really a good confirmation that the nest is unoccupied. Once the monitoring has occurred and the designated waiting time is up, then the nest can be destroyed, removed, if it hasn't been used by migratory birds since that notice was submitted. If the nest becomes active before that designated waiting time is up, you must then submit a notification to us so we cancel the nest notification. If the nest becomes abandoned once again, the same process will apply, but that clock starts over. This is page 1 of what the abandoned nest notification looks like. Pretty basic information, not too onerous. And this is the second page, just as a quick example of what to expect. I'm going to touch on a few permitting changes. And for those who are not familiar with the regulations, there are 7 different types of permits under the Migratory Bird Regulations. But the focus of this current phase of modernization of the regulations is less on permitting, but there have been a few changes that I think are important to highlight. So the first are for damage and danger permits. And here there's been some additions and clarifications. And the big one I want to highlight is that nest destruction is now permitted. So before you could destroy eggs and you could relocate nests, but you could never actually destroy a nest. And with all damage or danger permits, it's really important when you're applying for these, only apply for them if the migratory birds or their nests are causing or are likely to cause danger to human health or public safety, or the damage they're causing could be to agriculture, environmental, or other interests. For scientific permits, there's been an eligibility expansion. So you no longer have to belong to a museum, university, or scientific society or government in order to obtain a scientific permit. You can also now have nominees for these scientific permits. And when the last eligibility expansion for these permits is including rehabilitation purposes, as well as a few other activities, which you can look at on our website. Another change to the regulations is the temporary possession of a migratory bird without a permit. So there are 3 scenarios where this would be possible. First would be when you find a dead migratory bird, and this allows for you to either properly dispose of the bird or to take it to a lab for analysis. The second situation would be if you find an injured migratory bird, and this allows for the transportation of that bird as soon as possible to a wildlife rehab center, as long as they have a relevant scientific permit from us. The last situation would be when you find an uninjured migratory bird, but it's facing an imminent threat and it requires immediate assistance in order for it to survive. So a bird caught in a net would be a good example of this. The last change I want to highlight is just proper recognition of Section 35 Treaty and Indigenous rights within the Migratory Bird Regulations. So the first one is that feathers that are possessed by a person exercising Section 35 rights can be gifted to anyone for educational, social, cultural, or spiritual purposes. The second is that the regulations recognize that individuals exercising Section 35 rights can hunt migratory birds and harvest their eggs without a permit. And these are not subject to open season dates, bag, or possession limits. Lastly, the regulations now remove references to specific Aboriginal groups and instead just refer to a person exercising a right recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution. I'm going to now talk about incidental take of migratory birds and some of our avoidance guidelines. So for those not familiar with incidental take, we have these legal mechanisms in place, and these help to manage either intentional or direct take of birds and their eggs and nests. And so this is through permits that I mentioned previously. Outside of these permits, we don't have a legal mechanism, the way the legislation is written, to authorize take, whether it's intentional or not. So there are some circumstances where inadvertent killing or harming birds, or the destruction or disturbance of their nests and eggs, is a result of human activities that weren't specifically directed at those birds, nests, or eggs. This is a circumstance that we refer to as incidental take, and it's currently not possible to obtain a permit or an exemption for incidental take. To put this in context, there are going to be activities that are directed at taking migratory birds. So hunting, collecting eggs. As long as they're done with a permit, these are legal under the regulations and not good examples of incidental take. We know that there are kind of a suite of activities that are known to create take of migratory birds while not being the intent of those activities. So the big ones to highlight are vegetation clearing. So that's logging, haying, site clearing, mowing, brushing, or pruning. And at the wrong times of the year, these can often result in nest or egg destruction. Draining or flooding land is another common situation that can result in nest or egg destruction. And we also know fishing gear, where birds can get caught in long lines, for example, can cause harm to birds. And therefore, these are all kind of circumstances or situations that we would refer to as incidental take. There are activities that at times may take migratory birds, but are highly unpredictable or deemed accidents. So a bird collides with your car while you're driving on a highway. Still a violation of the act, but it's not going to be the focus of incidental take. So with incidental take, I want to highlight two main challenges. So as I alluded to before, there's a huge conservation challenge when it comes to mortality and therefore incidental take of migratory birds. And I think the thing to highlight here is that the sheer number of birds, eggs, and their nests that are destroyed each year during routine industrial and other activities is quite large, and the cumulative impacts of these different incidents over the years can have long-term consequences for migratory bird populations in Canada and further than that, of course. The other challenge with incidental take is this legal uncertainty. So we have no authorization mechanism for people to avoid incidental take. And so it will always be a contravention of the act. What we focus our efforts on is providing people with information so they can evaluate risk and determine best ways to either avoid completely or mitigate occurrence and conservation impacts of incidental take. So I'm going to go through all of these in a bit more detail, but the first are through avoidance guidelines. The second is technical information, timing of nesting, nesting zones and nesting calendars, bird conservation regions and strategies, and risk tables. And the last kind of tool we have is beneficial management practices and developing those. So I'll start with avoidance guidelines. So these are what we can provide to ensure there's consistent and practical recommendations to reduce the risk of incidental take. And what we do is provide scientific background information to help people determine their risk of harming migratory birds and to reduce that risk. So the first kind of thing we can provide are key risk periods, or when take is most probable. So the breeding season is a big one, but I think in terms of harm to individuals or disturbance, migration and wintering is also something important to consider, especially for species like snow geese that are only here in the winter. There's also key risk sites to consider, or where take is most probable. So in a migratory bird breeding colony, high probability of take there. The last piece is key risk factors, or how take is most probable. So a big one to highlight are birds colliding with structures. So increasing night at light during migration, reflectivity of glass panels can all impact how birds are taken, especially at particular times of year. The technical information we provide through timing of nesting for migratory birds in Canada is probably, I don't want to say the most popular, but the most talked about kind of piece of information we have. And I think it's a really important tool. And I'll go into these in a bit, but in a bit of detail, but I think it's really important to highlight that these are guidelines only, and that the They are designed to support planning of activities with the aim of reducing the risk of detrimental effects to migratory birds. But this is not the legislation. It is not the be all to end all, essentially. Nesting season, I like to say, can be any time of the year, depending on your species, depending on where you're working. But across Canada, the times of greatest risk are roughly mid-April to mid-August. So we have these general nesting periods, and again, these are across Canada, and these are multi-species nesting zones to help determine regionally relevant nesting periods, but again, across large geographic areas. Within each of these general nesting periods, there are regional nesting periods. That's where you get all the different colors on the map. And once you actually look at a regional nesting period, you can look more specifically at a nesting calendar. And these help to show the proportion of species that are predicted to be actively nesting on a given date. And these are broken down by habitat type as well. And I like to look at nesting calendars as, yes, they show the proportion of species, but it also kind of highlights your risk of encountering those species if you're conducting activities. So if you're working in that dark red area, that is you're at a high risk of encountering nesting birds during that time, especially if you compare it to the white or the light yellow periods. So the focus of the new regulations is really on protecting nests when they have high conservation value. And therefore, protection during the breeding period for migratory birds and their nests is really important. We recognize, of course, that despite best efforts, there's going to be some work that overlaps with the breeding period. There are additional ways that you can mitigate those activities of migratory birds by avoiding birds and nests. This can be done by searching for evidence of nesting birds. So this could be simply looking for the presence of birds in the right breeding habitat. You can observe them singing, making alarm calls, distraction displays, individuals with nesting materials and food. And you can also conduct surveys like point counts that can provide a really good indication of just presence of some birds and their nests in an area. We don't recommend active nest searches because they have a low probability of locating all nests. So if you're working in a complex habitat like a forest, species are designed to nest cryptically, like a hummingbird, for example, and their nests are going to be hard to find. You also have a higher risk of causing disturbance to nesting birds by conducting active nest searches. So if you're looking for a nest and you flush a female off of the nest while she's incubating, you risk the female abandoning the nest completely or leading a predator to that nest, and the nest becomes essentially, it could become predated or abandoned, and the function of the nest, the nest is unsuccessful. There are some surveys that can be appropriate when you're looking for obvious and easy to locate nests. So nests of swallows, barn swallows, or cliff swallows that you can see from a far distance on buildings. Great blue heron nests are another good example where you can again observe individual nests, but from a far distance where you're not actively disturbing those birds. Another tool we recommend for technical information is looking at bird conservation regions and strategies. So these are conservation planning tools, and they inform conservation priorities and practices through a nationally consistent conservation framework. Essentially, if you know what bird conservation region you're working in, you can actually look up what the priority as well as common species are, and therefore you can actually tailor your mitigations to those groups of birds or specific species. The last piece of technical information are these risk tables that we provide on the website. And these are categorized by a few different things, including knowledge of legal obligations and planning, biological factors, as well as the nature of your activities. And these just help to determine your risk level associated with different activities. So if you're working in a city park in February, you're probably going to be at a lower risk level because you're not in the middle of the breeding season and there's less likelihood of nesting. The last thing I want to highlight are beneficial management practices and how we can help with developing these. So for those unfamiliar with BMPs, these can just essentially provide guidance and methods to minimize the risk of harm to migratory birds, their nests and eggs, and address other effects of migratory bird conservation. Our role in this is to provide scientific background on migratory birds and their ecology, as well as with different management needs. We can help with interpreting the recommended objectives and conservation actions that you see in bird conservation regions, or with legislation or our avoidance guidelines. We can't support decisions, we can provide tools, and we can't endorse particular BMPs, as this could constitute officially induced error. I just threw up a photo of our bank swallow and sandpit and quarries BMP that we developed. It's only a few pages and it's obviously species and location specific, but it's an example of something that doesn't have to be too detailed that can still be effective.
But just in the last couple minutes here, I just really wanted to extend another thank you to Chloe and Jesse from Environment and Climate Change Canada for volunteering their time to present to us today on a long overdue, I think, but very important update to the MBR as it relates to the MBCA. And I know, especially in British Columbia, now that we are formally as RP Bios and PAGs under the auspices of the Professional Governance Act, it behooves us all to get as in-depth an understanding of these pieces of legislation and regulations that are related to our practice. So thank you again, and thank you all for attending, and thank your employers for giving you permission to spend an hour on professional development time on this important issue. And have a safe day, and good luck getting ready for the field season. Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.